You watch a baby crawl straight toward the edge of a bed, reach for a hot cup of coffee, or stare directly into a stranger's face with total unblinking calm. And your entire nervous system screams in a way theirs clearly doesn't. Babies seem to have zero concept of danger. None. They'll happily crawl toward literally anything. And then, seemingly overnight, somewhere around 6 to 8 months old, that same baby suddenly bursts into tears the moment an unfamiliar face gets too close. Fear didn't build up gradually. It arrived, almost like flipping a switch. So why don't babies start out afraid of anything? And what actually causes fear to switch on when it does? The answer is more precisely timed and more biologically deliberate than most people realize. Asterisk. Let's start with what newborns actually do and don't fear. Because the list is genuinely short, developmental psychologists have long identified only two fears that appear to be present essentially from birth: a fear of loud, sudden noises and a fear of falling, often demonstrated through the Moro reflex, the startled, arms-out reaction newborns show when they feel unsupported. Foundational research, including classic studies by psychologist John B. Watson in the 1920s, helped establish these as apparently innate, unlearned responses present before a baby has had any chance to learn what's actually dangerous through experience. Everything else — fear of strangers, fear of the dark, fear of specific animals, fear of heights beyond simple falling — isn't there yet. Which raises the obvious question. If fear isn't preloaded into a baby's brain, how does a baby survive those first several months at all? Now here's the part nobody talks about. Babies aren't actually unprotected during that fearless window. They're just protected differently, by the adults around them instead of by their own instincts. Researchers studying infant development have pointed out that during the earliest months of life, babies have extremely limited mobility, meaning most real environmental dangers simply aren't reachable yet. A newborn can't crawl toward a hot stove, can't wander toward a cliff edge, can't independently put itself in most serious danger because it physically can't move far enough to get there. In this specific window, constant adult supervision does the protective job that fear would otherwise need to do, meaning evolution didn't necessarily need to install fear responses this early, because the baby's own limited mobility was already handling most of the risk. In other words, fearlessness in early infancy isn't a design flaw. It's a feature that only works because it's paired with near total physical dependence on a caregiver. But that dependence doesn't last. Mobility increases fast. So what happens once a baby actually can move toward danger? Asterisk. Here's where it gets strange, because fear doesn't develop gradually alongside mobility. It arrives in specific, sudden, well-documented waves. Stranger anxiety, one of the most well-studied fear milestones in developmental psychology, typically emerges around 6 to 8 months of age, according to research published across decades of infant development studies, including foundational work by psychologist John Bowlby on attachment theory. This timing is not a coincidence. It lines up almost precisely with when babies begin developing object permanence, the cognitive ability to understand that people and things continue existing even when out of sight, and around the same window many babies begin crawling, gaining real independent mobility for the first time. Separately, the famous visual cliff experiments conducted by psychologists Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk in 1960 tested infant depth perception using a table with a checkerboard pattern that visually appeared to drop off, though covered with solid glass. Their research found that babies who could already crawl reliably avoided the visual edge, showing clear fear and hesitation, while younger infants without crawling experience showed little to no avoidance at all. This strongly suggested fear of heights specifically develops alongside and is triggered by the onset of independent movement, not simply age alone. So fear isn't arriving on some fixed biological timer. It's arriving precisely when a baby actually gains the physical ability to get itself into trouble, which is a genuinely elegant piece of design. But it raises a question about what triggers it so specifically. But wait, if fear is just switching on with mobility, why does stranger anxiety specifically target unfamiliar faces, rather than, say, fear of falling or fear of sharp objects? This is where attachment theory becomes central to the explanation. Researchers, building on Bowlby's foundational work, have proposed that stranger anxiety serves a very specific evolutionary function tied to caregiver proximity, as babies become mobile enough to potentially wander away from a trusted caregiver for the first time. A strong, sudden aversion to unfamiliar people functions as a behavioral tether, making the baby more likely to stay close to or actively seek out the specific adult who has reliably protected them so far. Fear of strangers isn't really about strangers being dangerous specifically. It's a mechanism for keeping a newly mobile baby anchored to protection, precisely at the moment independent movement makes wandering away from safety possible for the first time. This reframes the entire pattern beautifully. Each new fear that appears in infancy isn't random. It shows up exactly when the corresponding new capability, crawling, depth perception, independent movement, makes that specific danger newly relevant for the very first time. And that's really the thread connecting all of this. A newborn does not fear the stove because it cannot yet reach the stove. Newly mobile infant does not fear falling until it can finally, for the first time, actually move toward the edge. A crawling baby does not fear the stranger's face until wandering away from safety becomes something its own body can suddenly do. Fear was never late. It was simply waiting, precisely, for the exact moment the danger it was built to answer finally became real. That's the genuinely elegant design hiding behind what looks, on the surface, like a fearless baby suddenly and randomly becoming afraid of everything. Nothing about the timing was random at all. Astra, so what about the exceptions? Because surely not every baby follows this exact timeline. Correct, and it's worth saying clearly. Individual variation in fear development is well documented, and factors including temperament, attachment style, and specific life experiences can shift the timing and intensity of these fear responses meaningfully from child to child. Some infants show stranger anxiety earlier or later than the typical 6 to 8 month window, and some show it far more intensely than others, without this necessarily indicating anything concerning. Developmental psychologists generally treat these milestones as broad ranges rather than fixed universal deadlines every baby must hit on schedule, which is a useful reminder that even a genuinely elegant biological pattern like this one still plays out differently across real individual children, shaped by their own specific temperament and environment. So back to that baby crawling fearlessly toward the edge of the bed, reaching for that hot cup of coffee with total unbothered calm. That fearlessness was never carelessness. It was a body that simply hadn't yet developed the specific capability the danger required in order to matter. And once it does, right on schedule, fear arrives exactly when it's actually needed, not a moment before. We spend the rest of our lives assuming fear should just always be there, protecting us from everything, all the time. But the truth, written into every single one of us from our very first year, is that fear was never meant to run constantly. It was only ever supposed to switch on the moment we could actually reach the danger ourselves. We weren't born fearless by accident. We were born exactly as protected as we needed to be, and not a moment more.